In this video, we're going to be talking about the article for today, which is All Animals Are Equal by Peter Singer. So, who is Peter Singer? Well, as we can see, Peter Singer was born in 1946, and he is in fact still alive. There's a very nice picture up there at the top from our paper, Peter Singer when he was a young man, and then a more recent picture of what he looks like today. And I'll add that when I was in graduate school, we had the opportunity, Peter Singer came to Western University where I was studying and gave 2 lectures. And he is a big deal in the world of philosophy. And he actually has quite a following even outside of academic philosophy because of the particular kind of work he does. He's a very compelling speaker and, as near as I could tell, a very nice person. So who is he? He was born on July 6th, 1946, so he's 74 years old, and he's an Australian moral philosopher and the Ira W. DeCamp Professor of Bioethics at Princeton University, as well as the Laureate Professor at the Center for Applied Philosophy and Public Ethics at the University of Melbourne. He specializes in applied ethics and approaches ethical issues from a secular utilitarian perspective. So if we think back to last week, we'll remember that one of the ethical theories we looked at was utilitarianism, and Peter Singer is one of the most well-known modern proponents of that view. He's known for his book, Animal Liberation, that he wrote in 1975, and this in fact put him on the map as a philosopher. And in this book, he argues in favor of veganism, and he's also known for his essay, Famine, Affluence, and Morality, where he argues in favor of donating to help the global poor. So, Singer's argument in the paper that we're looking at has the following 4 premises and then the conclusion. The first premise is that human equality, properly understood, is a moral ideal rather than a claim about the actual equality of human characteristics. According to this moral ideal of equality, the interests of every human affected by an action should be taken into account and given the same weight as the like interests of any other human. That's the second premise. The third premise, the capacity for suffering, is a prerequisite for having interests, and so the capacity for suffering is also a prerequisite for the moral ideal of equality. Okay. This leads to premise 4. Species other than humans have the capacity for suffering, and so our conclusion, so we should extend to other species the moral ideal of equality that most of us recognize should be extended to all members of our own species. So this is Peter's argument, and I would, if you had trouble drawing this out of the text, that's okay. It took me quite a while to put together this version of the argument, and you could draw different versions of it depending on which pieces you wanted to highlight. But for our purposes, this is the version we'll be dealing with. So the strategy is that we're going to begin and spend a lot of time in this video setting up Singer's understanding of the principle of equality. That's sort of where a lot of our reading for today focuses. And according to Singer, once we properly understand the principle of equality, it'll be clear that this principle also needs to be extended to animals. The problem that I'll point out is that almost no one extends the principle of equality to animals, and this was especially the case when Singer was writing this in the 70s. And following from this, Singer's going to argue that most people are what he calls speciesist, or a person who discriminates against beings of different species. I said animals there, that's not strictly speaking true. It's someone who discriminates against, in this case, non-human species. Okay, so the context of the argument and some things that are important to kind of keep in mind as we move forward. Singer's presenting his argument about the equality of animals as an extension of an argument about the equality among humans. That's why he's talking about equality at the beginning of the essay. And this argument was written against the backdrop of various liberation movements during the 60s and 70s. And I'll also just sort of point out that because of the age of this paper, Singer sometimes presents ideas in ways that we might not present them in today. And certainly, if you find any of this particularly frustrating, I encourage you to reach out to me, and I'm happy to have a conversation with you about it. There certainly are some parts that we would say differently today, but this is a classic piece of philosophy, and so I think that there is some value in considering it in the way that it's written. But again, if you come across something that you really, really, really don't like, by all means, reach out to me and we can have a conversation about it. So, Singer's aim. My aim is to advocate that we make a mental switch in respect of our attitudes and practices towards a very large group of beings, members of species other than our own, or as we popularly though misleadingly call them, animals. In other words, I am arguing that we extend to other species the basic principle of equality that most of us recognize should be extended to all members of our own species. So we'll see there the conclusion of our argument. Now we might wonder, is this intended to be a joke? And Singer recognizes that his argument may sound like a parody of other liberation movements rather than a serious suggestion. And in response to this concern, he points out that the rights of animals were used to parody the case for women's rights in the late 1700s. When Mary Wollstonecraft published her book Vindication of the Rights of Women in 1792, it was satirized in an anonymous publication titled A Vindication of the Rights of Brutes that was actually written by Thomas Taylor. Now, in the 1700s, the word brutes was another word for animals. I also point out that Singer spells Wollstonecraft slightly differently. I'm using the more widely accepted spelling today. He is using a more archaic spelling. So, in case you notice that. In A Vindication of the Rights of Brutes, Taylor responded to Wollstonecraft's argument in favor of the rights of women by pointing out that her argument could apply equally to dogs and cats and horses as she had applied it to women. However, he continues with his objection, to extend an argument about rights to dogs, cats, and horses is obviously absurd. So the reasoning used to get to Wollstonecraft's conclusion must be flawed. But if the reasoning is flawed when applied to animals, it must also be flawed when applied to women. So this is the argument that Taylor puts forward in his satirical A Vindication of the Rights of Brutes. So one way that we might respond to Taylor's argument is to say that the case for equality between men and women can't validly be extended to non-human animals, right? This is a reasonable way to go, I suppose. Women have a right to vote, for instance, because they're just as capable of making rational decisions as men are. However, dogs are incapable of understanding the significance of something like voting, so it's reasonable to imagine that they can't have the right to vote. There are many other obvious ways in which men and women resemble each other closely, while humans and other animals differ greatly. So the response to Taylor concludes, men and women are similar beings and should have equal rights, while humans and non-humans are different and shouldn't have equal rights. So here's Singer on this point. The thought behind this reply to Taylor's analogy is correct up to a point, but it does not go far enough. There are important differences between humans and other animals, and these differences must give rise to some differences in the rights that each have. Recognizing this obvious fact, however, is no barrier to the case for extending the basic principle of equality to non-human animals. The extension of the basic principle of equality from one group to another does not imply that we must treat both groups in exactly the same way or grant exactly the same rights to both groups. Whether we should do so will depend on the nature of the members of the two groups. The basic principle of equality, I shall argue, is equality of consideration, and equal consideration for different beings may lead to different treatment and different rights. Okay. So from here, Singer develops a different way to respond to Taylor. So according to Singer, there's a different way of replying to Taylor's attempt to parody Wollstonecraft's argument that doesn't deny the differences between humans and non-humans. If we examine the basis that our opposition to discrimination about race or sex ultimately rests on, what we'll discover is that it'll be logical to extend the basic principle of equality to non-humans. So, in order to follow this line of reasoning, Singer begins by examining our understanding of equality. So, Singer's strategy from here. In order to make his point about the equality of animals, Singer begins by investigating what we mean when we talk about equality between humans. He begins by considering that when we say equality, maybe we mean something like actual equality between humans. It's going to turn out that this doesn't work. Next, he's going to consider that perhaps what we mean when we say equality is that different groups are on average equal. Okay, so on this view, what we mean when we say equality is that different groups are on average equal. And it's going to turn out that this doesn't work also. And this leads Singer to conclude that our understanding of equality shouldn't be based on actual equality found in the world. Instead, equality is a moral ideal, not a simple assertion of fact. All right, vocabulary break. So, you may have come across the phrase hierarchical inegalitarian society fairly early in the reading and wondered what this could possibly mean. What is a hierarchical inegalitarian society? Well, let's break it down. Hierarchical means arranged in order of rank or having to do with hierarchy. Inegalitarian means characterized by or promoting inequality between people. So, a hierarchical inegalitarian society is a society with an unequal hierarch, right? Or maybe we could rephrase this as an unequal society. Why, Peter? Why did you do this? We may wonder why it is he's using this particular phrasing. I think that, to be fair to him, he feels that saying hierarchical inegalitarian society gives him the precision that he needs to move forward with his arguments. So first we're going to consider equality as actually equal and see why this won't work. If what we mean when we use the word equality is that all human beings are actually equal, this simply isn't going to work regardless of what measure we use. Like it or not, humans come in different shapes, sizes, physical capacities, and mental capacities. I think we could all agree to this. So, if we're trying to base equality on all human beings, on actual equality between these humans, this is obviously an unjustifiable demand. And so, we can't mean actual equality when we're talking about equality, right? So, the idea here is that when we're talking about equality, we can't mean that people actually are equal to each other, because they obviously are not. So, what about the possibility of equality as on average equal? So we might instead think that equality means not that all individuals are actually equal to one another, but instead that equality means that people among different groups are on average equal. Although humans differ as individuals in various ways, there are no differences between the races and sexes as such. This is the idea anyway. And this view begins with the idea that from the mere fact that a person is black or a woman, for example, we can't infer anything else about this person. All right? So from this claim, we can see what's wrong with racism and sexism. So the white racist claims that whites are superior to blacks. But this is false because although there are differences between individuals, some black people are superior to some white people in all of the capacities and abilities that could conceivably be relevant. And on average, these differences even out and both groups are ultimately equal. Similarly, the opponent of sexism would say the same thing, right? A person's sex is no good guide to his or her or their abilities. Although there are differences between individuals across the gender identity spectrum, some people in any particular gender group are superior to those in a different gender group. And this is why it's unjustifiable to discriminate on the basis of sex, because on average, the groups end up being equal, all right? And I want to be clear here that it's going to turn out that this version of equality is also not the one that we want to use. So this is a possible line of objection to racial and sexual discrimination, certainly, but it's not, however, the way that someone really concerned about equality would choose to go forward. Even though it seems like it might be useful, it's going to turn out that it's not. And this is because, as we're going to see, this approach can, in some circumstances, first force a person to accept a very inegalitarian society, right? So we'll remember that inegalitarian here, what that means. So the problem with equality as on average equal. So imagine if our hierarchical egalitarian, the person that is enforcing the society, instead of using sex or race as the characteristic they focused on to drive their inequality, uses something like an IQ over 140. So a society that favors people with an IQ over 140, regardless of their other characteristics, doesn't seem any better than a society that favors one sex or race over another. I think we can all agree to that. But notice that if we tie the moral principle of equality to the factual equality of the different races or sexes taken as a whole, right, our opposition to racism and sexism doesn't provide us with any basis for objecting to this new kind of inegalitarianism, right? And this is because every member of our preferred group, right, people with an IQ over 140, has the characteristic that we're using to establish our inegalitarianism by definition. So we can create a problem for this view of equality by focusing our inegalitarianism on a characteristic that is associated with our abilities, or that does, in fact, group us into groups that aren't on average equal, right? So by its very definition, a group of people with an IQ over 140, it is true that they all have an IQ over 140, but this gives us no resources to object in the way that we saw earlier. There's a second important reason we don't want to base our opposition to racism and sexism on any kind of actual equality found in the world. This applies to even the limited kind of equality in the equality on average view. The reason is that we can have no absolute guarantee that abilities and capacities really are distributed evenly with regard to race or sex among human beings, right? So far as actual abilities are concerned, there do seem to be certain measurable differences between the sexes, for example. And these differences do not, of course, appear in each case, but only when averages are taken. More important still, we don't yet know how much of these differences are due to genetic endowments and how much are due to environmental differences that are the result of past and continuing discrimination. So given this, it'd be dangerous to rest the case against racism and sexism on the belief that all significant differences are environmental in origin. Right? The opponent of, say, sexism, who takes this line, will be unable to avoid conceding that if differences in ability did, after all, prove to have some sort of genetic connection with sex, sexism would be in some way defensible. Right? So we don't want our understanding of equality to rest on actual differences, because there may turn out to be actual differences, and this would be a problem. Okay, so this is a second problem with the view of equality means equal on average across the group. But luckily for us, there is a solution. Fortunately, there's no need to pin the case for equality to one particular outcome of this scientific investigation, or to the change of science over time. Instead, we should make it clear that the claim to equality does not depend on intelligence, moral capacity, physical strength, or any other matter of fact. Equality is a moral ideal, not a simple assertion of fact. There's no logical, compelling reason for assuming that a factual difference in ability between two people justifies any difference in the amount of consideration we give to satisfying their needs and interests. The principle of equality of human beings is not a description of an alleged actual equality among humans. it's a prescription for how we should treat humans. So when we talk about equality, we're not talking about actual equality in the world. Instead, we're talking about the moral ideal of how we should treat people. Okay, cool. So how should we treat people? Well, one way is each to count as one and none for more than one, right? So the interests of every being affected by an action should be taken into account and given the same weight as the like interests of any other being. This is the view of Jeremy Bentham, an early utilitarian. Or maybe the good of any one individual is of no more importance from the point of view of the universe than the good of any other. This is the view of a somewhat later utilitarian, Henry Sedgwick. So the idea here is that we should give everyone's interest equal consideration. So when we are approached with this question, how should we treat people? The answer is that we should give everyone's interest equal consideration. All right, so what follows from this? It's an implication of this principle of equality that our concern for others ought not depend on what they're like or what abilities they possess. Although precisely what this concern requires us to do may vary according to the characteristics of those affected by what we do. It's on this basis that the case against racism and the case against sexism must both ultimately rest, at least according to Singer. Now we arrive at speciesism. So it's in accordance with this principle of equality that speciesism is also to be condemned, right? If possessing a higher degree of intelligence does not entitle one human to use another for his own ends, how can it entitle humans to exploit non-humans? If a being suffers, there can be no moral justification for refusing to take that suffering into consideration. No matter what the nature of the being, the principle of equality requires that its suffering be counted equally with like suffering. If a being is not capable of suffering or of experiencing enjoyment or happiness, there's nothing to be taken into account. And this is why the capacity to suffer is the only defensible boundary of concern for the interests of others. The racist violates the principle of equality by giving greater weight to the interest of members of his own race when there's a clash between their interests and the interests of those of another race. The sexist violates the principle of equality by giving greater weight to the interest of members of their own sex. Similarly, the speciesist allows the interests of his own species to override the greater interest of members of other species. This pattern is the same in each case, and according to Singer, most human beings are speciesist. So, for the rest of the essay, Singer then describes some of the practices that show this. So according to Singer, there are three major forms of speciesism that we find in humans. Eating animals, including the way that we treat them while we're preparing to eat them, experimenting on animals, and what he identifies as speciesism in contemporary philosophy. So note that some of Singer's particular examples may no longer be true because this paper was written in 1970. However, inevitably, in most cases, there are still applicable parallel examples that would make his point in just the same way. And here I will also point out that for our uses, if you can understand what he's talking about when he's talking about the first two major forms of speciesism, so eating animals and the way that we treat them while we're preparing to eat them and experimenting on animals, that's good enough for our purposes. You don't need to understand exactly what he's getting at when he talks about speciesism in contemporary philosophy. So let's review Singer's argument one last time. Human equality, properly understood, is a moral ideal rather than a claim about the actual equality of human characteristics. According to this moral ideal of equality, the interest of every human affected by an action should be taken into account and given the same weight as the like interest of any other human. The capacity for suffering is a prerequisite for having interests, And so the capacity for suffering is also a prerequisite for the moral ideal of equality. Species other than humans have the capacity for suffering. So we should extend to other species the moral ideal of equality that most of us recognize should be extended to all members of our own species. There we go. Now, what do you think?